After the introduction, I started to say that, look, over the course of my career, there have been dramatic changes in public affairs, changes to creating and advocating and creating these strategies, certainly significant changes to how messages are delivered. And with all these changes, you can get heard over the cacophony of competing messengers. How? How do you break through the walled fortresses of obstacles like echo chambers and confirmation biases? How can you be sure your message is even being heard by your targeted audience? And then at the end, how do you measure the effectiveness of your efforts? This is what we'll be talking about today. Now, as public policy professionals, unfortunately, we exist in a system that rewards fragmentation and partisanship. We wade through a swampy plot littered with the corpses of quaint concepts like compromise and civil dialogue. Slide. Even in normal times, next one, please. Even in normal times, it's difficult to get the attention of decision makers. It's hard enough getting heard above the tens of thousands of competing voices and messages, all looking for ears and eyeballs. Add to that the extra challenge if you don't already have an existing relationship, or you're promoting an idea that might seem counterintuitive, perhaps even controversial. Next. Exceptionally challenging today when survey after survey suggests more and more people are using social media as their primary source of information, and decision makers are actively engaging with like-minded influencers and constituents. And we also know from research, and most likely our own experiences online, that it's all too easy to slip into and be influenced by echo chambers. What do I mean by that? Well, we're surrounded by them every day. On social media, we see them in the form of likes. Next slide, please. Likes, dislikes, unfriending, and even worse, being blocked by someone with whom we disagree or challenging our belief structures. Next slide. And when it comes to elective politics, echo chambers manifest themselves in many ways, and at the most basic level through redistricting. I mean, gerrymander creates these artificial and often absurd boundaries that fence us in with like-minded neighbors and can promote echo chamber isolationism. As just an aside, that center graphic is the route for the previous rock and roll marathon in Austin. And when a friend of mine was running it, I just queued up the route and realized it literally ran through 6 congressional districts. Next slide. Now, all of this algorithmic filtering and purposeful redlining perpetuates effective polarization. Now, this is the concept whereby individuals' feelings and attitudes towards their own group or political party intensify, become much more positive, while on the other side, their feelings toward members of the opposing party or group become much more negative. What's worse, from the perspective of promoting public policy, is that this echo chamber effect is really rooted in confirmation bias. Next slide. And scientific research reinforces this difficulty by pointing out just how prevalent confirmation bias is in us modern humans. A study conducted on behalf of the National Academy of Science a few years ago showed us that once an idea or an impression of someone gets into our brains, it becomes cemented, and it's extremely difficult to tear that down and replace it with a separate impression, even if all the evidence points to that second conclusion. I mean, after all, first impressions last, right? Now, confirmation bias not only influences how we think about the world around us and other people, but it also impacts how they perceive us. Now, I would argue, as public policy professionals, as hard as it is to circumvent this, you need to. I'd also argue this is the key to returning our national town square dialogue to a state of civility. It requires looking past those first impressions and trying to find out exactly what makes a person unique. So let's explore that concept with a brief self-reflection exercise. Now I'm going to put up a series of lists, and on each list, I want you to pick the item on the list that best describes you. And if it's not an exact fit, pick something that's close to how you perceive yourself or your desires. First list. Choose your car. Now, as you're driving around in this car, you might get a bit hungry, but who has time to wait for a table with a diplomat, right? So where might you stop for a quick bite? And of course, being the day after Halloween, you've probably got some leftover candy, but you want to fill that sweet tooth. What would be your go-to? Next list, please. Okay, and then at the end of your long day, you finally made it home, and the only thing you want to do is watch a bit of TV. Turn the clock back to 2009, before any of us were streaming, and choose from this list what you might be most likely to watch. Now, for the past several presidential elections, National Media Research, Planning, and Placement's been conducting exit interviews with voters. And in addition to the typical questions they may ask, like for whom did you vote? Do you identify Republican, Democrat, Independent? Do you vote often or seldom? They would also throw in some random consumer preference questions and then overlay onto a plot the results. So, next slide. For instance, their research suggests that if you drive a Tesla, you skew hard left and vote quite often. So if you can see the screen well enough, pick out your car. See if this fits your personal profile. Now, what about the food choice? Next slide, please. I guess it's really no surprise where Chick-fil-A and Cracker Barrel end up here based on most people's perceptions of them. I find it notable that Wendy's, McDonald's, Subway, they've really found that sweet spot right in the center. Now, what about candy? And this one is all over the map, right? And I know the type might be a little small to see some of these, but as opposed to Wendy's and McDonald's, the one thing that strikes me here is that this research shows that Hershey's is very diversified and is targeting very broad audiences. Any surprises so far? Now, what about your TV viewing preferences back in 2009? Anybody have Celebrity Apprentice? Come on. The demographics have shifted on that a little bit, haven't they, since 2016? So why is all of this relevant? Well, once you recognize that the labels people attach to you may not be the real you, you realize, go backwards, please. You actually realize that this hinders your ability to see who they really are. In other words, your confirmation biases can begin to break down, and you're forced to discover what really makes someone tick, and your ability to get their attention increases. As you navigate this increasingly difficult world of public affairs, well, how do you recognize and get around all of this confirmation bias and the effect of echo chambers? How can you make sure your messages are really being heard? Well, it starts with creating a sound advocacy plan, creating clear, concise messaging, and evaluating your progress. Now, it's also essential that you have as much knowledge about your targeted audience as you can possibly gather. This forces you to disabuse yourself of any inherent bias you may have about those individuals, and then you can craft a strategy and messaging that allows them to see past their own biases. Next slide. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to know your audience. What makes an individual tick? For instance, let's say that you're scheduling a meeting with a decision maker. Take the time to learn as much about them as you possibly can. What influences them? Well, personal relationships, obviously, friends, family, the people that they listen to, personal interests and passions. We all have them. What makes us tick? Right? What gets our attention? What keeps us focused? It's also important to recognize their jurisdiction. What actually can they do to help you move towards your policy goal? And along with that comes their loyalties. Now, we all have them. We all belong to groups. We all have affiliations, right? And in the elected political world, political parties, right? And of course, constituents. Who do they answer to? This can often be one of the most important questions. And in the world of elected politics, it's typically a question that the decision maker asks on every policy decision they have to make. How is this going to impact the people I have to answer to? And we can't ignore the impact the media has. The influence of a trending story clearly participates in the policy development world. And most importantly, the message. Now, I know I may sound like Captain Obvious with that one, right? But what you say to decision makers and how you say it is actually extremely important. Slide, please. And after getting a meeting with a decision maker, don't spike the ball. You've still got so much work to do. Here's a great list of delivery tips I have used as an owner's manual, basically, with all the teams I've led over the years. Set the tone in advance. Send them materials. Let them know what to expect. Why are you coming in and taking up part of their valuable time? And when you're actually there, channel your mother. Be polite. Be patient. These things take time. Don't expect them to sign on or write you a check in the room, right? Always tell the truth. Don't try to make up answers to questions. Don't miss an opportunity to say, well, I don't know the answer to that, but let me get back to you. What have you now done? Well, one, you've created an opportunity for a follow-up conversation. Telling a personal story is absolutely critical here. It's easy to come into a meeting with a decision maker and give facts and figures. But if you can get them to relate to the impact some policy suggestion or existing policy is having on individuals they care about, they'll be much more focused. I think it's absolutely essential not to throw your opponents under the bus. Sure, you've got people who you're competing with on this idea, and sometimes they can be very vitriolic in their opposition. But recognize their points, point out where you think they are wrong, but give the decision maker your side of the story so that they can see the complete picture. This next one's one of my favorites. Look, we all have our golden nuggets, right? We have the thing that makes us tick, that really gets us motivated and energized. And the corollary to that is we also have our kryptonite, the thing that just shuts us down. Take some time to find out what that is for your audience. What is it that really gets them moving? Work that into your narrative. When you're talking about your policy objectives, your policy goals with a decision maker, make sure you prioritize. Have a backup plan, have a couple of different options, but don't flood them with so many requests that they lose sight of what you're asking them. And in that same regard, be specific. Don't just go in and say, well, we need to take care of climate change. No, have a specific goal, objective in mind for them to take on as an assignment. And then just as you set the tone in advance, leave something with them afterwards. Look, you are 15 minutes maybe of what is a very busy day for them, and there will be how many more 15 minutes they have to sit and listen to someone throughout the course of a day. If you give them material to refer back to when they can focus their attention on your message, they'll have it at their ready hand. And in the same token, they'll probably have questions when they do get around to it. So offer to be a resource. Hey, call me if you have any questions on this. We could spend another 15 minutes just talking about this one point, but don't want to take up your time now. Here's my contact. Feel free to reach out. That's why I'm here. And of course, at the end, say thank you and follow up. Don't think you've crossed the goal line just because you had 15 minutes with a decision maker. Take the initiative. Follow up with them. Now, let's step back to that point about being specific. Next slide, please. Always have an ask. Look, particularly on Capitol Hill, the answer is almost always yes. It's the advocate's role to raise the bar on what that yes is. Have an ask. Obviously, it could be a policy ask. Please support this bill. Oppose this potential regulation. Write a regulation that fits what my constituents need, what my clients need. At the same time, it can be a relationship building ask. Hey, we've got a site in our district, in your district. We'd like you to come visit it. Would you mind if we give you a draft of an op-ed? You could submit it or make a statement for the record. Now, in conclusion, there's one clear metric for success in any public affairs campaign. Did we pass a piece of legislation? Did we get an agency rule written that benefits us? Was spending increased? But usually it's not that simple. I mean, look, we all know you can do everything right in a public affairs campaign and still fail. There are so many externalities and variables working in opposition to us. So what's the best way to maximize your potential for success? Well, it all starts with asking two straightforward questions. Are our strategies and our efforts making an impact? And are we making progress towards our goal? Well, how exactly can you tell if you're making progress? While there's a lot of scholarly analysis of advocacy efforts, the vast majority focuses on the past. Historical review of big ticket items like how did the Affordable Care Act get passed, or what was the impact of lobbying by the large banks during the financial crisis in 08-09. But there is a methodology that you can use to create a change strategy and then evaluate progress and outcomes. We're going to call it the composite logic model for advocacy evaluation. Next slide. The model's approach focuses on three primary components. Sorry that you're seeing the end result of this slide, but I'll walk you through it quickly what it is. Come back, please. It focuses on policy impacts and goals. It focuses on activities and tactics, and then interim outcomes. What do we mean by impacts and goals? Well, you have to start at the end by defining what you're trying to achieve. When you're considering this question, think about where the issue currently stands in the public policy process. For instance, if it's early in your campaign, maybe your goal is simply to raise awareness that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. Or if the issue has been well known for some time, it might be the actual policy solution that's your goal. Pass a bill, change a rule, make sure it doesn't get changed. And you ask yourself in this process, who's our intended audience? What will it take to convince or move that audience towards our goal? Like it might be ultimately the decision maker, right? It could be on the front end, which community organizations do we need to bring into our coalition to help advance our cause? And look, most strategies will have multiple target audiences. And then it's time to think tactically. You want to identify the activities that you think are essential to moving you towards your goal. Now, the majority of these are going to be external activities like earned media, paid media, social media, flyers, getting people to show up for a rally, getting constituents to fly in and go visit decision makers. Those are externally facing activities. But don't forget the internal tactics and activities as well. For instance, research, policy analysis, proposal development. These are all important in-house practices. And as you're going through the activities and tactics part of your planning, it's always important to ask yourself, is there a contingency plan? If relevant, identify several paths to the end goal. So if you go down one path and it's not getting traction, you have something else ready to engage. Then when you look at interim outcomes, and the use of the word interim here is very intentional. As you're identifying those activities and tactics you're going to use, be thinking about what interim outcomes are achievable, not just the end goal. You should constantly evaluate and adjust your strategy. Just think of these as steps along the path to ultimately achieving your goal, and what are the direct results of those activities and tactics. And look, quite honestly, we could spend another 30 minutes or an hour just talking about the individual components of this composite model, but here are my key takeaways. Next slide. Here are 5 tips for evaluating an effective advocacy campaign. Again, identify your key issues and prioritize. Have multiple options for your goals. Select those tactics that will advance your cause. Be thoughtful about them. Always factor in the resources at your disposal and the realistic application of using those tactics. Identify those metrics that you can use to evaluate that success. Did we get members to co-sponsor this bill? Did we get comments filed at the agency that got noticed during their rulemaking proposal? Maybe it's just as simple as having your lobbyist visit with a decision maker. Remember, it's both quality and quantity you're looking for here. Because if something's not working, maybe you only got 10 people to show up at your protest rally. Reevaluate. See how you can change, but constantly evaluate. That comes from collecting your data. You can put this in a spreadsheet. You can use a CRM database, whatever works for you. But as you've identified the tactics you're using and you're looking at the interim outcomes as a result of those tactics, keep a record. Constantly evaluate, constantly change if you need to. And all this boils down to assess your success. Constantly monitor what's working and what's not. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this approach to evaluating an advocacy campaign, you can find several examples online that can be easily customized or have already been customized to different fields simply by searching for composite logic model for advocacy. Now, as we explored today these topics of the impact of echo chambers, limiting nature of confirmation biases, and we've discussed now some tools and techniques that you can use for creating and evaluating a public affairs campaign, I hope you found this informative and helpful for your cause. So with that, thank you for your time and good luck.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. Now we've got some time for some Q&A, so I'd encourage you all to use the Q&A section in the chat on the right. We've already got a couple of questions that have come in, so I'll go ahead and start. The first one is, how have you seen message delivery best practices shift as politics have gotten less local?
That has been a bane of my professional career. When I started on this path, it was about relevance to the district. It was about constituencies, and it was about having someone on the ground here who could be the front line if we were talking about federal politics. For instance, having those personal relationships was so important. Having the resources to create those personal relationships is always a gift. As I've shifted into higher ed, I lost a lot of that ability. I lost the resources, right? Because we're a nonprofit state-based organization. Then the messaging had to turn back more to the impact on the district. It was fortunate with the University of Texas system that we had so many campuses dispersed across the state that so many members of the Texas delegation had a campus presence, or a number of their constituents were either alumni or were sending their children to those colleges. That created the personal relationship, but it shrunk our universe. Obviously, we didn't have campuses all over the country. So the messaging had to become much more focused and localized, and trying to build external coalitions and collaborations with other universities that might be sharing the same problems and solutions. Now, add to that social media. It is exceptionally hard to get a decision maker's attention when all they're doing is scrolling through their feeds and not paying attention to the other side, right? And they're always pushing out messages to promote that, right? So it's very hard to break through that now. I'm seeing more and more positive use of social media and proactive use of social media. I'm seeing more and more success using tools like Quorum and others that help you identify and know your audience, your target audience better, and then manage your strategy internally. I'm seeing a lot more best practice sharing among advocates and public policy professionals. What does work here, what doesn't work there. And then we're also seeing, certainly since the onset of the pandemic, an increased amount of localized activist activity. I mean, there's a whole, as you probably well know, there's a whole cottage industry out there of groups that will tell you how to create an online or a grassroots organization and get them motivated and stage a protest and all of that. Hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, do you have any tips on how to strike a balance between emotional appeal and logical appeal when meeting with decision makers?
Well, that is an excellent question. It does start, as I said, with knowing your audience. What is their emotional golden nugget or their kryptonite? You will lose their attention immediately if you start a conversation that is so offensive to their personal beliefs or their political alignment that you're not going to get anywhere. But if you can find a way to tie what motivates them politically to what you bring personally through anecdotes, through solid policy proposals, to demonstrations of the impact of a solution on their constituents or on people they care about, you're going to be much more effective.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, are there any campaign examples you would point to that reflect strong, effective results?
Wow. I don't spend a lot of time on the campaign side. It is where my political life started, however, because literally the day I was born, my father became a campaign manager for a neighbor who went on to become a member of Congress. In those days, it was standing on the back of a flatbed truck in a homecoming parade, throwing out bubble gum and bumper stickers, and then husking the sidewalks with buttons and flyers. My dad driving around town in a baby blue station wagon with loudspeakers attached on top, playing a reel-to-reel song from the dashboard. A lot of that's still important, there's no doubt about it. But campaigns have become much more global. And by that, I mean, they're not just isolated within a particular district or a state anymore. Think about the impact of Governor Youngkin's election campaign in Virginia, how much that was influenced by an ongoing national dialogue over education. You can't ignore the fact that social media has really shrunk this sort of voter participation and at the same time expanded knowledge and excitement about issues. I I'm going to give that thought more question, because that's an excellent thing to watch for as we head into this election season.
And just as a follow-up for that, and maybe a point of clarification, does that question change in terms of strong effective results if we're talking about an advocacy campaign versus just a political one?
Yes, very much so. Campaign plans, strategies, and all that, our political campaigns, I guess I should say, are much more public facing. There's a lot of in-house strategizing that goes on, but everything you're trying to do is build ID and get more voter attention and ultimately more votes. An advocacy campaign is much more quiet, you might say. Now, there's obviously public-facing aspects of this. You want to get more people on board. You want to get petitions signed. Maybe you want to get more people at your rally. But much of what happens is geared towards that one-to-one influence of a decision maker.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is, do you have any advice for building relationships with members, especially via email follow-ups, and any advice around timing?
Timing is a great consideration. There are so many tugs and pulls on a decision maker's time. If you have spent any time at all working in an elected official's office, you know that people are constantly demanding your time and your boss's time. Look for an opportunity to get to know them outside of that time a little bit. And quite frankly, that's where campaign contributions gets a lot of attention these days. You're raising the awareness of your organization, your employees, your clients. But separate from that, make sure that you are visible. You're not just relying on email. Make sure that you're walking, you're showing up. Make sure that you're using that little phone button, right, on your mobile device. Phone calls are still very relevant. Writing, thank you notes, all of that still has a place in the modern world. And then as far as the timing, the old adage here in DC is you might get more attention during a congressional recess than you would during the height of votes. Still holds true to a large extent. What's happening more and more that I see is that advocates are going away from Washington during those periods and getting out into the areas where members are, whether it's a political event or they're campaigning for their reelection.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question, and we have a little less than 10 minutes, folks, so we have time for a few more for sure. So keep asking those. These have all been great. Our next one is, what kind of KPIs can we take to senior leadership in our orgs, those that aren't immersed in advocacy or lobbying, to show our work, especially in times of divided government when there is less legislation being passed?
Yeah, that is an extreme challenge these days. But think back to what I talked about with interim outcomes and tactics. Think about the small things that you can measure. Collect that data. Did you get more people to sign on to a petition? Did you get more people to show up at an event? Did you get a meeting scheduled with a decision maker? Did you get them to make a statement on your behalf? Did they add their name to a co-sponsorship, or did they post something? Did they come visit? Think small. Right? As I said, I've told my bosses over the years, in DC, we measure our success in inches. Oftentimes, policy goals take a long time to achieve. You can measure those impacts that you make, and only if you're evaluating and constantly assessing. And like I said, keep a record, keep a spreadsheet, CRM, whatever you use, and use that as the physical evidence. I'll give you a case in point. When I was at the UT system, one of our primary goals was helping our researchers increase their federal grants and the volume of research dollars brought back to a particular campus. I more than once had the chancellor would want to make my personal evaluation based on that increase. We're going to increase by 5% next year, right? Well, I had to constantly tell them, look, there are so many externalities and variables outside of our control in this sort of pursuit that the best we can do is make the field better for our people so that they get recognized and they build a reputation with the decision makers.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question. 80 Proof Podcast. When will there be more shows available?
Yeah, it's been a little slack. It's been a busy summer. We're getting turned around, identifying a few more guests. And what would make that easy is if you guys send me ideas. Typically, it's someone in the public affairs world, be it communication side or lobbying side, whatever. And we sit down and talk about how they use tools and techniques and how they measure their success. What are some of their big challenges? And then always end up by talking about their career path. You know, how did they get started in this field? How did they advance from being an intern somewhere to now running a Washington office somewhere? So if you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, feel free to reach out. Email is is 80proofhost@gmail.com.
Awesome. Next question is, any advice for moving work during a government shutdown or during a time when people are preparing for a government shutdown?
Yeah, you can't let that stop you. You have to prepare, and this is a perfect opportunity to make sure you have personal anecdotes at your disposal. I've had to work through a couple of shutdowns in my career, and the first thing we did while preparing for that eventuality was show the immediate impact. Back in the UT days again, if we could identify that the shutdown of the federal government would have a negative impact on research that someone was doing to try to cure Alzheimer's, for instance, would this shut them down for a while? Would it slow the response they were getting from their sponsoring agency? That could often have a dramatic impact.
Awesome. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left. And if we got time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. So give folks just a second to put anything in there. Otherwise, really appreciate all of your time and your patience while we work through some technical issues today. We really appreciate that. The next sessions coming up at 11 a.m. Eastern are Taking Your Public Affairs Global with Neil Simon and Engaging Legislators and Staff with Edison Pruitt. To join you, just want to go back to the main event page and select which of those two sessions you would like to attend. And thank you all again for your time. Thank you, Bill, for speaking. This was, I think, really engaging and a lot of great things to take away from. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your... Oh, we got one more question. How do you strengthen grassroots advocacy and state representatives?
Would you state the question again, please?
The question is, how do you strengthen grassroots advocacy and state representatives?
Yeah, that can be exceptionally powerful at the state level, and it certainly is becoming more and more powerful at the federal level. But one thing you need to do is, as you are creating the strategy and you're looking at those tactics, identify those organizations and individuals who are thought influencers within their realm. It might be a community activist. It might be a group of employees from a certain industry sector. Getting them engaged and personally invested in them allows them to be an influencer with others to come to your cause. You'll also want to make it easy for them, right? Perhaps it's a briefing, it's an info session. You're providing Coke and cookies, something to give them a little incentive to come listen to your spiel and get engaged. It also helps to have someone deliver this message who can relate to them. Perhaps they've been in the same shoes, they've worked at the same factory, or they are part of this community activist target audience who they're trying to make an impact locally. Try to make it relevant to them and make it easy for them to participate in your process.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Really appreciate all of your times again, and give you a couple of minutes to refill those coffees, stretch your legs, and then go to the next session. Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for your patience in attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you much.